On June 5th, 1981, a curious report appeared in the weekly bulletin of the Centers for Disease Control. 5 young gay men in Los Angeles were diagnosed with an unusual form of pneumonia. 2 of these men passed away. They were the first cases of AIDS. Days after the initial report was published in newspapers, the CDC became aware of several similar cases in gay men with other secondary infections, including rare and aggressive cancer. 26 gay men in New York and California had these diseases, and the number was growing exponentially. Scientists and doctors struggled to understand what caused the disease and how it spread, making it even more difficult to find a cure. About 2/3 of the people have flu-like symptoms within the first 2 to 4 weeks of becoming infected with HIV. These may include fever, chills, rash, night sweats, muscle pain, sore throat, fatigue, swollen lymph nodes, mouth ulcers. These symptoms can last a few days to several weeks, but some people have no symptoms at the early stage of HIV. The second stage is critical latency. The virus is still multiplying, but at a very slow level. People at this stage may not feel sick or have symptoms. Without treatment, people can remain in this stage for 10 to 15 years, but some get out sooner. Eventually, it weakens your immune system, causing AIDS, with symptoms including rapid weight loss, frequent or severe fevers, night sweats, extreme and unexplained fatigue, persistent swollen lymph nodes in the armpits, groin, or neck, diarrhea that lasts for more than a week, mouth, anal, or genital ulcers, pneumonia, red, brown, pink, or purple spots under the skin or in the mouth, nose, or eyelids, amnesia, depression, and other neurological disorders. All these symptoms can be associated with other diseases. The only way to know for sure if you have HIV is to get tested. If your HIV has progressed to AIDS, many of these severe symptoms and diseases of HIV are caused by opportunistic infections as the immune system is compromised. Dr. Anthony Fauci, who became the director of National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases at the height of the AIDS epidemic, calls it the dark years of his early career, caring for people every day who inevitably pass, usually within a short period of time. That experience was shared by many doctors who treated early AIDS patients. There was nothing they could do to end the suffering. In the summer of 1981, the alarming new disease began to plague gay men, first covered by the local gay media, but soon reported by the New York Times with the headline, "Rare Cancer Seen in 41 Homosexuals." 234 people in the United States lost their lives to the illness that year. In 1982, the CDC used the term AIDS for the first time. By the end of the decade, more than 100,000 Americans had lost their lives. Fear spread throughout gay communities. Everyone knew there was a possibility they could have it, but there was no way to know for sure, as there was no way to check. At the same time, all your friends were suffering and losing their lives. In the early 80s, when sodomy laws were still in force in most U.S. states, it was not considered a priority to treat the disease, which primarily affected gay men and then eventually needle sharers. Jocelyn Elders, Bill Clinton's former Surgeon General, said, "When you talk about sex or substances, it's a moral issue, not a public health issue." Years later, Elders was one of the many still raising the alarm, before being abruptly fired for insisting more open and honest forms of sex education. But then it was left to gay men and their dedicated allies to militarize and find solutions when no one else was. Initially, and too long afterwards, the diagnosis was essentially a death sentence. It would take until 1985 for an official test to even be available. With little knowledge of what it was or how it was transmitted, gay men were forced to act, even as their friends were passing away. It was described as a dread and mourning, but with a a desire to survive and find a way out. Activists such as Michael Cullen worked for decades on spreading awareness in the community, such as writing a comprehensive manual of how to have safe sex during the epidemic. This was criticized as being sex negative, making an effort to restrict people's sex lives was difficult. In New York, San Francisco, and LA, gay liberation was extremely popular at the start of the epidemic. Promoting safe sex was met with a lot of resistance because it felt like decreasing the progress the gay community made to be accepted. It wasn't just encouraging safe sex, it felt like being forced to go back and adapting back to what was considered mainstream by society at the time, which was harmful to gay acceptance. One of the main places the disease spread initially was in San Francisco bathhouses, seen as a liberating space for gays to express their sexual freedom. The spread of HIV quickly turned them into a potentially dangerous source of infection. I wonder how much more popular hookup culture would be if STDs didn't exist. It would be cool if all sex was considered safe and there was no such thing as risky sex, but I am completely ignorant. Reagan's apathy and inaction towards the situation was horrifying. When journalists asked about it, they were laughed at. It was seen as a joke, not an issue of great concern. It took 4 years and the passing of actor Rock Hudson to cause action. Reagan did not make a public mention of AIDS until late 1985. Meanwhile, the far right used the opportunity to continue pushing homophobic agendas, further isolating the community by spreading the harmful misconception that the disease was a punishment for a sin. I wish the stigma surrounding sex would be resolved. I consider it beautiful and enjoyable. It shouldn't be an activity that is frowned upon, whether it is a hookup or between people who love each other. AIDS perpetuated hateful prejudices upon people who were already seen as separate from the mainstream, while progressions were made, especially in life-saving medication. There is still no vaccine, even with worldwide infections estimated at 85 million and fatalities at 40 million. There are needle exchange programs, and still sex education is treated as a moral issue. During the late 1980s and 1990s, more effective treatments changed the lives of those living with HIV. Treatments being approved during this time, the public's perception of HIV and AIDS also began to change, mostly due to high-profile activists and celebrities. One of the activists was Ryan White, an Indiana teenager who contracted AIDS in 1984. Due to contaminated needles, he experienced discrimination in his community after his diagnosis, even being denied entry into his middle school. Princess Diana helped break down the stigma and myths surrounding the disease by being pictured visiting AIDS patients in the hospital and shaking hands with them without gloves. In 1981, NBA star Magic Johnson revealed that he had been diagnosed with HIV, his identity as a straight black man, helping to show that anyone can be infected. After treatment started to be invented, despair turned to hope, hope turned into faith, and faith turned into joy. Many patients returned home to their normal lives. There is no clear explanation as to where the virus came from. The first recorded case was confirmed by blood samples from a Congolese man who passed in 1959. Although he was HIV positive, the exact details of whether he developed AIDS and died from it are unknown. Scientists have been able to track the history of the AIDS virus through research. They believe patient 0 lived in Cameroon and contracted the disease around 1908 after hunting a chimp and being infected with SIV. If accurate, this suggests that the disease was confined to remote areas for decades. Decades later, when the AIDS crisis began, in the 1980s, there was only one perception. It only infected young gay men. These men soon developed rare, opportunistic infections that previously only affected people with weakened immune systems. Although HIV and AIDS originally appeared decades later, some even believe it appeared as early as the 1930s. It didn't become an epidemic or a widespread fear into the 80s. At least 2 more cases of HIV were identified in the United States in the 1960s, both in children who got infected by blood transfusions. In 1981, the disease was referred to as gay-related immune deficiency, or GERD. Despite the name change, society at large called the virus gay disease because of its rapid spread among gay men. Landlords and roommates drove people into the streets. Rupert Whittaker told The Guardian about his boyfriend Terry. They did not know that Terry's illness was linked to this American disease, as they called it when he first went to the hospital. They just thought it might be contagious, so he was isolated. Rupert was not allowed to see him. He had to look through the skylight into his isolation room. All who entered were in full protective gear. I wasn't told anything. Our relationship wasn't recognized until he literally just passed. I went to see him, and they tried to revive him while I waited in the entrance of the ward. I brought some lollipops and things he wanted. The nurse came out and put me to the side and said, "I'm sorry, he just passed." She asked who I was, and I said I'm his boyfriend. He later wrote to Terry's consultant and asked for confirmation of the cause of death, and he said, "Well, you're not family. I can't tell you anything. But if you started a charity, I could probably tell you something." I was 19 and paid for the funeral with my student grant. One person I knew was Irish. I was very close to him, and he passed suddenly. He refused to test because he couldn't handle the thought. His family kicked out all his gay friends and forced him on his own deathbed to renounce his homosexuality and accept the last rites or burn in hell. Some people were treating those who were incredibly vulnerable terribly, he said, but I don't think we would have the same-sex marriage today without AIDS, because it showed the first time that we are real people and suffering. Lisa Power worked for a health line called the Gay Switchboard during the AIDS epidemic. She said basically we were a helpline to share information about what gay bars are in Burnley, or to support someone who felt lonely and wanted to come out. When the pandemic hit us, we didn't really know what was coming. People ran in all directions. Some thought we should all give up sex. Some said it was just gay men. Then there were so many theories floating around. Some said it was a CIA plot. Some people just didn't believe it and said that the pharmaceutical industry was trying to sell medication. It was a time of deep confusion, and when we learned more about it, a time of great fear. We had no idea it was a virus that you got, and then it lay dormant for a while, contagious while causing no obvious damage. Many young gay men moved to London to be gay in their social life without having to tell their parents at home. We were in a situation where some people found out their son was gay when they saw him wasting away in a hospital bed. It caused all kinds of reactions. Some of the parents were wonderful and incredibly supportive and actually started volunteering with organizations trying to help people with AIDS. And then you have others who didn't want to tell anyone what their son passed of. I remember the researchers talking to health officials all over the country. They told one official, "We want to know what you're doing about AIDS." They said, "Oh, it's okay because we don't have gay people here. Try the next block. They have a theater." There was a time when gay bars didn't have windows, so no one in could be seen from the outside, and they would have been broken from vandalization anyway. There was a time when no one in the police was out gay, and only a few were out gay in the health field, causing all sorts of problems. But thousands of people tried to help, many of them lesbians, other gay men, who were horrified but constantly faced their fear to provide essential services. In 1987, Jane Burton was a nurse and joined the infectious disease unit in Leicester. She said, "When I first joined as a nurse, patients were not treated very well. There was no compassion or empathy. Visiting had very strict rules. The patients had very little freedom in any sense of the word, and they were dying young men. The nurses were not so bad that they did not bring food, because those nurses were infectious disease nurses, so they weren't as cruel as many of the other workers we knew, but they weren't interested, and they didn't sit to talk or help because of what was happening. I especially wanted to work in HIV. I spent a lot of time with patients. I remember one clearly. He could not communicate. He was so scared and so withdrawn that he couldn't speak or look at you at all. But eventually I broke the ice, and he became quite active when someone showed him the care and love he thought he didn't deserve. It was so bad. There was a lot of self-judgment going on among patients. It was also very difficult to deal with the bodies of the deceased. We had a gentleman who had passed and had salvaged a suit that he wanted to wear. When we put him out, it was so sad because he didn't fit his smart modern suit at all, but amazingly, we had a lot of fun too. People were still trying to live their lives. I'm in touch with people I worked with. They are the only ones who know what it was like. Ian Green was 18 in 1983. He was exploring his sexuality. He says, "I remember my father reading the news, and there was a headline about a man who passed from an AIDS-related illness. That was the moment it really hit me. If it could affect him, then it certainly could affect me. HIV was a big concern for me as a young gay man. Not a day went by that I didn't think about it, and it was definitely on my mind every time I had sex. It prevented me from developing good, close relationships. So many of my sexual experiences were very secretive. I was completely in the closet for most of the 1980s. I didn't discuss it with my old circle of friends, and certainly not with my family. In addition to being socially unacceptable, homosexuality was also a deadly virus. I couldn't get it out of my head. I was very afraid of dying alone because I had seen other friends and partners pass themselves. I became HIV positive in 1996. I was very lucky to be diagnosed at a time when treatment became available. The side effects were nasty, but they extended my life, and now I have a normal life expectancy. In 1989, this photo was published in Life magazine. After a 3-year struggle against AIDS and its social stigmas, David Kirby could fight no longer, as his father, sister, and niece stood by in anguish. The 32-year-old founder and leader of the Stratford, Ohio AIDS Foundation felt his life slipping away. David whispered, "I'm ready," took a last labored breath, then succumbed. Reddit user Station53 said, "I was with my brother when he died of AIDS, and in a very similar way as seen in this photo, only I was the sole family member still in his life and supporting him through this ordeal. All the others had turned away. That was more common than not back then. His breathing was so labored near the end, his face nearly identical to the one in the picture. I remember telling him I loved him and that it was okay to let go. A short time later he did, and the tenseness of his struggle was slowly replaced by an overwhelming sense of calm and peacefulness. I was so happy. His pain ended at last. left, yet devastation, he was gone. I can recall my uncomfortable sobs, and even now, all these years later, I can't stop the tears from rolling down my cheeks. An experience like mine and countless others is life-altering. The memories triggered by a wide variety of common things, and yes, even photographs like this. We were less than 2 years apart in age and were best friends. I still think of him every day and miss his physical presence in my days. This was such a sad time for so many. The user later adds, "To say I'm overwhelmed by the outpouring of sympathy and compassion and all your comments would be, well, a massive understatement. Thank you so much. Though I hasten to add my story is but one of the countless others who have experienced the same thing, or worse. My brother passed in 1987, a time when being gay was not what it is today. Thankfully, while my brother and I were very close, there was at least one thing he kept from me. I learned about his AIDS diagnosis at the same time he told me he was gay. At that time, having AIDS was essentially a death sentence, and the uncertain road walked by those having it was usually a long and painful one. Once word got out about his condition, he was effectively disowned, banished from the family. The same was true of most of those he considered friends. He continued working as long as he could, but eventually he no longer could. He lived alone in an apartment in a large Midwestern city about 4 hours from where I was living at the time. I thought it was important for him to live in familiar surroundings for as long as he could, so I contributed financially so he could have that. Fortunately, I had a traveling sales position at the time, and with both the approval and encouragement of my boss, spent a lot of time with him. Countless doctor visits, pharmacy visits, general errands, and hanging out. They were, as they remain today, my fondest memories of him. After he passed, his body at his direction was cremated. There was a small service at a funeral home attended by only a handful of people. It seemed, well, strangely fitting for an introvert that, like him, who was never really comfortable around a lot of people. He and I are a lot alike in that way, so I could easily relate to his wishes. And yes, I was the only family member present. He once told me he'd arrived in this world alone and that he wanted to depart in the same way. It was pretty much how it went, though I couldn't allow him to die alone. Those final 32 hours sitting beside him in the hospital are hours that I'll always cherish, and while he didn't get his die alone wish, I don't think he'd be mad at me for sticking with him until the end. Much of who I am today on multiple levels I owe to him and all of the love, support, and encouragement he gave me during his life. You know, we should all be lucky to have someone in our lives like that, family member or otherwise. And the rest of my family, interestingly enough, nearly all members of my unusually small family are now dead. In any gathering afterwards, he and his passing were never acknowledged. However, once a year or so before my father died, in a rare moment of clarity and introspection, fueled by what I suspect is a wee bit too much scotch, he admitted to me in passing his regret over how he dealt with my brother's situation, as he called it, as it likely is for anyone who's lost a loved one. I'm constantly reminded of him, even after all these years. A sound, a situation, reruns of The Golden Girls, one of his guilty pleasures, he told me, a song by any number of his favorite bands, and more. Those who've been through something like this will know the feeling, the sensation. And his cremains, His wish was to visit a place in the mountains he's always read about and seen pictures of, but I had never had the time to physically go. So on the first anniversary of his death, I fulfilled that wish by casting his remains to the wind in the skies above Boulder, Colorado. I've yet to revisit that place, and I may never feel a need to return. He remains alive with me, and that's all that really matters now. Thanks for allowing me an opportunity to share. A final note: cherish those who are special to you with all your might, and do so while you can. Never allow regret a place in your life. Reddit user ChilledMonkeyBrains1 says, I was part of the San Francisco Clinic study, aka the frozen blood study, in which blood samples from gay men who visited the clinic for vanilla-type STDs in 1979 through 1980 were frozen for some years. Not, as I understand, with a specific plan in mind, but because it was a large and likely very useful cohort. Later, well into the 1980s, after HIV had arrived, they contacted each of us and froze the samples and began periodic testing and interviews that continued for several years after. I only officially knew something was wrong when I decided to open my folder and ask for my status. By the way of explanation, for many years, lots of us preferred not to know, given that the only treatments were incredibly toxic and destructive. Life in the 1980s was depressing enough, as I detailed in other postings, and the stigma was many times more intense and demoralizing than today. When I did this, I learned I've been HIV positive since my sample was taken in 1979, and likely for some time earlier. I had random bouts of ordinary sickness like the flu, but nothing hinting strongly that I had HIV, though I had lost some weight over time very slowly. That was 1991. So at that appointment, in addition to my antibody result, I got many years of semi-annual T-cell counts, from which I did the only sensible geek-worthy thing. I erased home to make a line graph of. It was a shock to see how widely the counts have fluctuated over time, and to imagine how my decisions and outlook might have changed if I'd chosen to know my result earlier. It was even scarier to see that my T-cell percentage, a somewhat more accurate image of the immune system health, had been declining rather steadily. For the next 4 years, my health declined generally, and my T cells fell below the 200 threshold that demerits the boundary of AIDS. But I never had any anomalously named AIDS-defining infection. Still, it was a pretty dark time. I took disability in 1995 and basically waited for the Reaper. Then came the pretense inhibitors and combination therapy, thank you David Ho, and everything changed, yanking a million of us back from the blink. I started meds in 1996 and made a jaw-dropping rebound, including a weight gain of nearly 25 pounds, mostly muscle, requiring new clothes. Had a few rocky spells with the first set of medications, but was thoroughly improved by and back in the workforce full time in 2002. I hardly think about it at all now, and I'm not exaggerating. I take 3 antiviral pills once a day, along with 8 supplements. 2 of them minimize drug toxicity, which they do successfully, and I never think about HIV when taking them, or even when sorting them out the week. I have no side effects to speak of. My boyfriend is also HIV positive, so we have no awkward moments of being careful not to say the wrong thing. I never thought this would be my future. During the period between getting my result in 1991 and the rebound from the first set of meds in 1996, I was absolutely certain I'd never live to see the millennium. Now I'm over 60, working at a high-pressure job that I mostly love and have no plans to retire anytime soon.